This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app. Evenings with Kevin O'Sullivan.
On Talk Radio.
Yes, we're going to talk about the business backlash against Boris after his speech yesterday. Let's go straight over to the head of research at the Adam Smith Institute, Matthew Lesh. Good evening, Matthew.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm very, very well. Can you just bear with us? We're going to have a little listen to Boris delivering a message to the business world.
We're there to support industries that are having difficulties, but fundamentally it's up to them to work out the way ahead. In the end, those businesses, those industries are the best solvers of their own supply chain issues. Government can't step in and fix every bit of the supply chain.
Well, Matthew, his speech yesterday, Boris's speech, in political terms, was something of a triumph. He preached to the converted down up in Manchester, and they absolutely loved it. And around the nation, everybody thought, what a funny guy. Lots of great jokes, real upbeat, feel-good, joke-packed speech. So I think in terms of a political performance, there's no doubt about it, it was a success. But it's a bit like the budget, isn't it? 24 hours later, people are really starting to examine the details, and a rather bleaker picture is emerging. And the critics, particularly from the business community, are saying, OK, you made a lot of jokes. You were funny about the Labour Party. You were funny about this, that and the other. But the speech was economically illiterate because this nation is facing some terrible problems, and the business community being told, well, it's not my job to fix everything for you, while they are suffering a terrible supply line collapse and a crippling problem in recruitment, I don't think was the best message to send at a time like this.
Yeah, look, I think you're absolutely right. Boris, the entertainer, is a fascinating speaker and a superstar politician. But at the same time, and I think this is where there's a big difference with the budget, it was pretty weak on detail. The rhetoric was stirring, but the content was largely vacuous. And where he was talking about the economy, it was, in my view, economically illiterate. As well as broadly inconsistent. He talks about a low-tax economy. We're on track for one of the highest tax burden since the Attlee post-war socialist government. He talks about wanting a high-wage economy, but of course that requires productivity improvements. And all we have right now is a serious supply-side shortage issues and inflationary pressures. Now, while Boris is absolutely right to say that ultimately these issues are for businesses to solve, and they will solve them. These supply side issues won't last forever. We've got a situation where people saved up a lot during the pandemic. They're now coming out to spend it. That's putting a lot of pressure on the demand side of the economy. The supply side hasn't quite caught up. There've been a lot of supply side shocks as a result of COVID. That's not even just related to the UK. That's globally. We're seeing this all over the world, that there's issues with supply, particularly just one factor alone, the cost of shipping from China has gone up 5, 10, 15 times. It's just extremely expensive. That's pushing up the cost of everything. But, and this is where it's important, where Boris can pull the levers, where he possibly can make things a little bit easier for business and for help the adaptation, he's not doing so. He's not allowing for businesses to bring in migrants to fill skill shortages. Now, I'm a Brexiteer. I accepted Brexit. I had an argument about controlling migration, but I never thought it meant zero migration. In fact, I thought it meant allowing the skills we need at the time in which we need them. And right now we need those skills. And it seems absurd to me that we're not saying, fill the shortages that need to be filled.
Yeah, as I say, it was a great feel-good speech and it was very funny. And at the end of it, you actually did for a brief moment think, do you know what? All's well with the world. Britain is rocketing into a brighter future. And then you start to sit down and think, actually, what actually is going on? I mean, apart from the supply chain collapsing and the problems that cause, the crippling recruitment problem, we've got inflation, rampant inflation on the way. And there is much for him to do, and he should not be sitting around saying it's not my job to look after business. He ought to be thinking about looking after business. I mean, do you feel as a Prime Minister that he actually convinces himself that everything's right with the world? Because if he has done that, we're in a bit of trouble, because I can't remember a time when we were facing more problems than this.
Yeah, look, I'm in some senses actually share Boris's broad optimism about the world. I don't think everything is going to hell in a handbasket. I don't take the negative worldview, but as a serious politician with serious issues going on out there, I think that the tone was perhaps slightly misguided. But also, I just think, okay, say everything's going to be great, and say we're the businesses will sort this out, which I have no doubt is true. But also then say what you're going to do to get out of the way, to enable businesses to prosper. Be a conservative. Be someone who understands that the role of the state is not to control our lives, but rather to get out of the way and let businesses do their job in providing our prosperity and providing our highest standard of living. What we're seeing with Boris is kind of the opposite, though. We're seeing the highest taxes since the post-war era, as I was saying. We're seeing very little interest in deregulation. When it comes to housing, which is a pet issue of the ASI, the Answers Institute is really interested in the impact on housing. That really drags down our productivity because people can't live closest to where they're most productive. It means people are spending ridiculous amounts on rent. Boris, when it came to the detail about housing, seems very unambitious compared to previously, where he's not willing to take the reform decisions. And he has a huge majority in Parliament. He has an 80-seat majority. This is the time for ambitious, perhaps even controversial economic reforms that could set Britain up for decades to come. But instead, what we see is quite minimalist and quite disappointing from Boris when it comes to actual policy detail.
I mean, there is this element to his personality, isn't it, where he just sort of inhabits the upbeat optimist world, and he has this sort of propensity towards convincing himself that everything is great. And I think for example, his green energy policies is just pure fantasy. It's pure fantasy. He's trying to sell us the myth that this entire country can be fueled and powered by wind turbines and solar panels. It just can't. It's not true. And yet he tells us that the green energy is coming our way, it's going to power this country, and it's going to make all your energy bills cheaper. Well, it's already making all of our energy bills considerably more expensive, considering we pay a levy on our utility bills to fund our green fantasy. And once again, he's talking this beautiful sunshine game, but there's no substance to it.
Well, look, I think we're not overly seeing the cost of having a grid that's largely increasingly dependent, I should say, on solar and wind, not only in terms of the green levies, but also in the fact that in recent weeks when we've seen that the wind hasn't been blowing as much, hasn't been particularly sunny, when the backup comes in, which is gas, and the prices are skyrocketing globally for gas across Europe, particularly because we don't allow fracking in the UK, so we don't have as much domestic gas as we potentially could have. We're actually seeing huge increases in prices as the grid. And this is where solar and wind is quite deceptive. It appears on the margin these days quite cheap, but the grid cost, the cost of ensuring a consistent supply of energy is quite high. I mean, that's why I'm personally a big fan of nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is very expensive to construct and set up, and I think we need to take a look at that in the way we fund nuclear energy, the way we regulate nuclear energy, just to make sure that the costs don't skyrocket as much. But ultimately, it is the only source of cheap, green, consistent energy. And the fact that you just see what's happening now. You compare France and Germany. France decided after the oil crisis in the 1970s that they would invest big in nuclear energy. So something like 70%, 80% of their energy supply comes from nuclear. Germany made a very questionable decision to shut down their nuclear reactors after the Fukushima crisis in Japan. Yeah. And as a result, Germany's using more coal than ever. So if you want to be green, you've got to be pro-nuclear.
Yeah, and of course we, because it's not renewable, we scrapped our big gas storage centre, and the gas storage centre was there when our grid went down, and obviously our grid goes down quite a lot because it relies on there being wind. It's not always windy, and also with solar panels it relies on it being sunny, and as you know, Matthew, in this country it's quite often not sunny, so we have to have this backup, and we closed down our major gas storage centre because we couldn't classify gas as renewable. It's madness. It's absolute madness. And I think the only chance this country has got is that Boris, in that sunshine, upbeat, optimistic speech that he made yesterday, knows that it was merely wallpaper over the cracks of a growing reality, a growing grim reality.
Yeah, look, I hope Boris becomes a more serious politician, but I don't know about you. I'm not particularly optimistic.
I wouldn't
the
bet
thing
the
about
farm
government
on
as
it.
well is, well, exactly. I mean, I'm not. The weird thing about government, of course, is the prime minister can only do so much, and he's only one person. And I think Dominic Cummings' analysis is right that we act as if the prime minister controls everything and does everything, when in practice, Boris in particular probably actually controls and does very little. We've got a system that's led by a mixture between civil servants and perhaps some active secretaries of state, and they're the ones ultimately defining what the policy settings are. So I think it's probably worth, in some senses, paying less attention to Boris than we do, even though he grabs our attention as an entertainer. In practice, what's going on is far broader and far less in his control than we might like to think it is.
Yeah, and also the other thing that he seems to be undivertible on is constantly rising taxes. Now, this is infuriating traditional Tories. David Davis wrote a very angry piece in one of the Sunday papers saying you can't do this as a Tory leader. He doesn't seem to be particularly evangelical when it comes to traditional conservatism. So rising taxes is going to annoy traditional Tory supporters. It's also going to annoy business leaders, and his insistence that it's not his job to sort out supply chains or recruitment problems, that's going to annoy a lot of people as well. He's going to have to sort of change course a bit on all of this, isn't he?
Well, look, I think so. There's this kind of misconception, I think, amongst the government about why they won the last election. They seem to think that they won the last election because they promised a bigger state. But I think we have to be realistic here. If what people wanted was more taxes, if what people wanted was excessive spending on public services and social welfare and whatever else, they would have voted for Jeremy Corbyn. You've got an aspirational class of people who saw they could relate to Boris, who want to rise up in the world, who don't necessarily want a high burden of tax. And the fact that Boris has broken that central manifesto promise is just so dangerous. How can Boris go to the next election saying, I'm not going to raise taxes? How can voters trust him in future if he's so quick to get rid of his previous commitments? I think this is actually not just a big danger for Boris, but could be a long-term danger for the Tories. And we're potentially going to see this as elections come up. It's like, why do I bother voting for Tories? Why am I going to show up if they're just going to tax me like Labour will?
I think the duplicitousness that was there was obvious insofar as they chose the slogan, the electoral slogan, Get Brexit Done. They didn't choose will raise taxes, did they? But all along, he intended to do that. And he is what Richard Tice of the Reform UK party calls a con-socialist. There's something quite socialist about Boris, isn't there?
Well, look, absolutely. I don't think Boris has the free market instincts. I think Boris is ultimately a true populist, not in the sense of what populist is normally used for, just in the sense that he just does whatever he thinks is going to win him short-term electoral benefit, whatever he thinks he can sell publicly. He's not someone who seems to stand by any particularly strong principles. I remember just a few years ago, when Boris was running for Conservative Party leader, he talked about how we're not hearing enough about free enterprise, how we need to support our free enterprise economy and business, and we need to lower taxes and lower regulation. I mean, he said all the right things to say when he was running for leader, and when Conservative Party members opted for him to become leader. When he went to election, he similarly said that he'd lower taxes, or at the very least not increase taxes on national insurance, as he has done. But instead, he's got these big set aspirations. He wants to spend money on the NHS. He wants to spend money on social care. He wants to spend money left, right, and centre. He doesn't seem to have a sense of fiscal responsibility. You've got to kind of feel sorry for Rishi here, of course, who then has to try to fund all these things. To some extent, he's got to play a bit of a game here with Boris and just, well, calm down a bit. We don't have unlimited amounts of money. There are decisions that need to be made. And this is where I think COVID is kind of being quite deceptive, because we could spend a lot of money in the short term on COVID. People now think that there's no spending restraint anymore, but now there has to be more spending restraint because we've just borrowed so much. We have to be more responsible than before.
I'll tell you what, Matthew, in the next few months, we're on the way up to Christmas. I think it's going to be quite eventful for Boris and indeed for all of us. Great to talk. Thank you so much for your time. Matthew Lesh there. He's the head of research at the Adam Smith Institute. When we come back, we'll be talking about Sir Peter Bottomley's contention that it's desperately difficult to live on an MP's salary of a mere £82,000 a year. Get real, Sir Peter. I'm Kevin O'Sullivan and this is Talk Radio.
Online,